The first act was already failing when Queen Thessara Velkion decided she hated everything about the evening. The troupe on the embassy stage moved through their positions with mechanical precision, delivering lines about galactic unity in voices so polished they'd been scrubbed of anything resembling feeling. Thessara sat in the center of the royal balcony, her silver-threaded gown catching the amber stagelights, her expression arranged into the serene mask her court expected. Around her, 200 delegates from 14 species applauded politely at a joke about trade tariffs. The Concord's annual cultural exchange, 3 days of performative diplomacy disguised as art. She'd attended 11 of these. She could have written the program herself. "Your luminance seems distracted," murmured Councillor Dreth from the seat behind her. His voice carried the particular brand of concern that meant he was cataloging her behavior for his next advisory report. "I'm captivated," Thessara said, not turning. On stage, an actor in a foam headpiece meant to represent a Korethi ambassador tripped over his own tail prop. The audience laughed. Thessara did not. The program listed 7 performances across 3 evenings. 6 were from established Concord member world troops, safe, vetted, inoffensive. The 7th, slotted last on the final night like an afterthought, was listed simply as Original Dramatic Work, Human Delegation, Writer-Performer, M. Hale. She'd almost crossed it off. The human delegation had only been part of the Concord for 9 years, barely long enough to earn a seat at the economic tables, let alone a cultural platform. But the scheduling committee had insisted, symbolic inclusion, they called it. Thessara had allowed it because refusing would have generated more diplomatic friction than the performance itself could possibly cause. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now she sat through the Velkathi interpretive dance number, all swirling bioluminescent fabric and no discernible narrative, and counted the minutes until she could retreat to her quarters and review the morning's intelligence briefings. The war in the periphery had claimed 2 more frontier stations. Her sister Aelith's faction was pressing for a vote of diminished confidence. The trade compact with the Sorelian hegemony needed her personal seal by dawn. None of that could be addressed from a theater seat. The Velkathi finished to enthusiastic applause. Thessara clapped 4 times precisely. The lights shifted. A stagehand wheeled out a single wooden chair and a small table with a lantern on it. Nothing else. No set pieces, no backdrop projections, no costume racks. A man walked out from the wings. He was human, that was immediately obvious. Mid-30s, maybe older. Brown hair cut short enough to be practical, long enough to suggest he didn't care much about regulations. He wore a plain dark jacket over a collarless shirt, no insignia, no diplomatic sash. He carried a leather-bound folio in one hand and nothing else. He set the folio on the table, pulled the chair to the center of the stage, and sat down. The audience shifted. Councillor Dreth leaned forward. "Is this the human entry? There's no set." "Apparently not," Thessara said. The man, M. Hale, she presumed, opened the folio, looked at the first page for a long moment, then closed it again. He looked out at the audience. His eyes were steady and unhurried, the way a person looks when they've already decided what they're going to do regardless of the reception. "This is a play about a queen who stopped listening to music," he said. His voice was unremarkable, no theatrical projection, no dramatic pause, just a sentence spoken clearly into the vast hall. She didn't stop because she disliked it. She stopped because she'd heard too many songs written to please her, and none of them had ever told her the truth. Thessara's hand tightened on her armrest. He opened the folio again and began. The play had no other actors. Hale performed every role himself, the queen, her advisors, the court musician who tried and failed to write a song she hadn't already heard. He didn't use costumes or props. He shifted his posture, changed the cadence of his voice, and the characters appeared. The queen sat straighter when she spoke, her words clipped and precise, carrying the weight of decisions made alone at 3 in the morning. The advisors bustled and deferred and said nothing useful. The musician grew increasingly frantic, producing grander and grander compositions that the Queen received with perfect, devastating politeness. "Beautiful," the Queen in the play said after the musician's seventh attempt. "Truly, you've captured the mood of the season admirably." And the musician knew, with the certainty of a craftsman who'd spent his life reading rooms, that the Queen had heard nothing at all. Thesara realized she had stopped breathing. The play's first movement ended with the Queen alone in her chambers, staring at a window that showed stars she could name by their trade routes, but not by their light. Hale delivered her monologue sitting in that wooden chair. His voice dropped to something private, almost conversational, as though he were talking to someone just off stage who wasn't there. "I remember when I used to listen," the Queen said. "Before every note became a petition, before every lyric was a request wrapped in melody. I used to hear music and feel it land somewhere behind my ribs in the place where decisions hadn't calcified yet. I don't know when that place sealed over. I only know that when the last musician played, I counted the measures until it was finished, and I hated myself for counting." The hall was silent, not politely silent, the kind of silence that happens when 200 people realize simultaneously that they've been addressed personally by a stranger. Councillor Dreth shifted in his seat. "Bold," he whispered. "Presumptuous, some might say." Thesara said nothing. She was watching the human's hands as he turned the page. They were steady, not performing steadiness, simply steady, the way hands are when they belong to someone who's done this particular kind of work enough times that the fear has been replaced by something quieter. The play's second movement introduced a new character, a traveler who arrived at the Queen's court without credentials or appointment. He'd heard, somewhere on the frontier, that the Queen had stopped listening to music, and he'd walked halfway across a continent to ask her why. "I didn't come to play for you," the traveler said. Hale shifted in the chair, leaning forward now, his voice rougher, more direct. "I came because I heard a Queen stopped listening, and that seemed like something worth understanding. Not fixing, understanding." The Queen's court didn't know what to do with him. He had no petition, no trade proposal, no marriage offer. He asked questions nobody had asked before, not about policy or alliance or the disposition of fleets, but about the last piece of music she'd loved. The last time she'd been surprised by a line of verse. Whether she'd ever written anything herself, and if so, whether she'd burned it or kept it. Thesara's throat had gone tight. She uncrossed her ankles, crossed them again. Beside her, Councillor Dreth was watching the stage with the expression of a man trying to determine whether something was an insult or a gift. The play moved quickly. Hale had a craftsman's instinct for economy. Every line carried weight, every silence earned its space. The traveler didn't try to impress the Queen. He asked her to collaborate. He proposed they write something together, not a court commission, not a diplomatic anthem, but a private work. A play within the play, something true. The Queen refused. The traveler asked why. The Queen said truthful art was a luxury she'd surrendered when she accepted the crown. "Truthful art isn't a luxury," the traveler said. "It's the opposite. Luxury is the performance you commission to avoid saying what you mean. Truthful art is what's left when you strip the commissions away. It's cheaper than luxury. It just costs more." Someone in the Korethi delegation laughed, a single, surprised bark of recognition. Then a murmur passed through the hall, not laughter exactly, but a kind of collective exhale, as though the audience had been holding something and the line had given them permission to set it down. Thesara felt her mask slip. Not visibly, she was too trained for that, but internally behind the architecture of composure she'd spent 23 years constructing, something shifted. Like a door she'd sealed being tested from the other side. Not forced open, just tested. A knock, quiet and patient. The play's third movement was the collaboration. Hale performed both characters writing together. the queen offering fragments of experience she'd never spoken aloud, the traveler shaping them into scenes and verses. They argued about structure. The traveler wanted rawness, the queen insisted on form. They compromised, disciplined form containing ungoverned content, a skeleton of meter housing wild, unvetted feeling. The play within the play that emerged was about a woman who'd inherited a dying garden and had to decide whether to replant it or pave it over. It was, transparently, a metaphor, and Hale didn't pretend otherwise. The queen in the outer play said as much. "You've made my dilemma into a garden metaphor. That's what every poet does." "Yes," the traveler said. "But the question is whether the metaphor made you see the dilemma differently. Did it?" The queen paused. In that pause, Hale let the silence stretch until it became the answer. Thesara pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger. Hard. A private pain to anchor herself against the public one she hadn't expected. Because he'd written her life. Not the details were different. Thesara was not a queen who'd stopped listening to music. She was a queen who'd stopped reading poetry. She'd loved it as a girl, before the crown, before the wars, before her mother's assassination had placed the weight of the Velkayan dynasty on shoulders that had been busy memorizing stanzas. She'd read her last poem the night before her coronation, a Thessani elegy her mother had loved. And afterward, she'd sealed the book into a cabinet in her private quarters and never opened it again. No one knew that. No one alive. Her mother was dead, her sister was a political rival, and her advisors catalogued her habits for leverage, not understanding. And this human, this M. Hale, had walked onto a stage and written a play about the exact shape of that silence, without knowing whose silence it was. The play's fourth movement was the one that broke the audience. The queen and the traveler had finished their private work. The play within the play was complete, a small, fierce thing, too honest for a court performance, too personal for public display. The queen said she would have it archived in the private collection. The traveler said nothing. The queen asked if he was disappointed. "No," the traveler said. "You wrote something true. That's the work. Whether anyone else hears it, that's a different question, and it's yours to answer." But the queen's chief advisor discovered the manuscript. Read it. Recognize the queen's voice in it, not her diplomatic voice, not her policy voice, but the voice underneath, the one that still remembered what it felt like to be moved by words instead of obligations. The advisor was horrified, not because the work was scandalous, but because it was vulnerable. A queen who could be moved was a queen who could be manipulated. A queen who wrote truth was a queen who'd revealed her pressure points. The advisor brought the manuscript to the queen's council. Hale performed the council scene with devastating precision, 7 voices, each one finding a different reason the queen's private art was a political liability. One called it undignified. One called it a security risk. One suggested the traveler had been planted by a rival faction to extract state secrets through creative collaboration. "He didn't extract anything," the queen said, and for the first time in the play her voice cracked. "He asked me what I'd lost and I told him. That isn't extraction, that's conversation." Thesara's eyes were burning. She blinked once slowly, the way she'd trained herself, a monarch's blink that looked like composure rather than the suppression of tears. The council voted to expel the traveler. The queen overruled them. The council threatened a vote of diminished confidence. The queen looked at the chief advisor and said, "You've advised me for 14 years. In all that time, have you ever once asked me what I'd lost? Not what the throne had lost, what I had lost." The advisor had no answer. "He asked," the queen said, "on his second day, before he knew my trade routes or my fleet numbers or the names of my rivals. He asked what I missed, and I didn't have to be the queen to answer him. I only had to be the woman who remembered." Thesara gripped both armrests. She could feel Dreth watching her, cataloging the tension in her jaw, the rigid line of her spine. Let him catalog. Let him file his report. She was watching a man on a stage describe the inside of a locked room she'd never shown anyone, and she could not look away. Around her, the hall had shifted. The Korethi ambassador had set down his diplomatic stylus, the first time all evening he'd stopped taking notes. The Velkathi cultural attaché had leaned forward until her observation visor nearly touched the railing. Even the Tesserin junior diplomats had stopped scrolling. And Thesara was seeing the cabinet in her private quarters, the tarnished clasp, the sealed book, the 23 years of silence she'd mistaken for strength. The play's final movement was the shortest. The queen did not marry the traveler. She did not abdicate. She did not dramatically burn the council's objections. She did three things. First, she opened the palace archives and placed their private manuscript in the public collection, simply walked it down herself, signed the catalog entry, and shelved it beside the state histories and the trade compacts. When the archivist asked for a classification, the queen said, "Honest." Second, she reopened the court's cultural program, not the sanitized diplomatic showcases, but a standing invitation for any artist from any world to perform work that had not been vetted by committee. Third, and this was the moment the hall went completely still, the queen found the traveler on the morning of his departure. He was packing a single bag. She stood in the doorway. "You could stay," she said. "As what?" he asked, not bitter, not negotiating, genuinely asking. "As the person who asks me what I've lost," the queen said. "Once a day, more often if necessary. The title is negotiable." The traveler looked at her. "What did you lose today?" "An hour of sleep," the queen said. "I was reading." "Reading what?" "The play we wrote. I've read it 4 times since midnight. It's not perfect, the second act sags, and the garden metaphor is heavier than it needs to be. But there's a line in the 3rd scene where the woman says she's been watering stones because she forgot what soil looked like, and every time I read it, I feel the place behind my ribs that I thought had sealed over, and it hasn't. It hasn't sealed. It was just waiting for something worth opening for." Hale stopped. He closed the folio. He looked at the audience with the steady, unremarkable gaze of a man who'd said what he came to say. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then the Korethi ambassador began to clap. Then the Velkathi. Then the Sorelian trade envoy and the Merkai defense attaché, and the 3 junior diplomats who'd been scrolling their datapads through every other performance. Thesara did not clap. She sat perfectly still, her hands on the armrests, her face composed, her eyes bright with something she had not permitted in public since the day her mother died. Dreth was staring at her. Half the balcony was watching the queen instead of the stage. She stood. The applause faltered. A queen standing before a performance concluded was a diplomatic signal, and nobody was sure which one. "Councillor Dreth," she said, her voice carrying the full weight of the Velkayan register. "Arrange a private meeting with the human writer before the morning session." Dreth hesitated. "Your Luminance, the morning session begins at." "Arrange it." The meeting took place in the small anteroom off the Queen's study, a room with actual windows rather than projected views, and shelves that held physical texts rather than data crystal arrays. Thesara had chosen it deliberately. It was the room where she kept the cabinet with the sealed book of poetry. She'd prepared nothing, no agenda, no talking points, no list of questions vetted by her diplomatic staff. She simply sat behind the desk and waited, which was itself so unusual that the 2 guards outside exchanged glances when she waved off the pre-meeting brief. Hale arrived without escort. He changed his jacket but otherwise looked the same, unhurried, undecorated, carrying the folio like a workman's toolkit. He stopped inside the door and inclined his head. Not a bow, a nod of recognition between equals, which was either deeply respectful or deeply presumptuous depending on which protocol manual you consulted. "Sit," Thesara said, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. He set the folio on his knee, waited. "Your play," Thesara said. The queen in your play stopped listening to music. Who told you that story? Nobody. I wrote it. You wrote a play about a queen who sealed away the art she loved when the weight of rule became too heavy to carry both. You performed it in front of a queen. You're telling me that's coincidence? Hale looked at her directly. His eyes were brown, an unremarkable color, the color of turned earth, of old wood, of things that lasted because they didn't need to shine. I wrote it about a queen, he said. Not about you. I didn't know you before tonight, but I've known courts. I've been writing for delegations for 6 years, cultural exchange programs, diplomatic showcases. I've watched a lot of people in a lot of balconies listen to a lot of polished performances and applaud 4 times exactly and leave without having heard a single word. At some point, I started wondering what it would take to make one of them actually hear something. And your answer was to write about the cost of not hearing. My answer was to write about what gets lost when hearing stops being possible. Yes. Thesara sat down. She hadn't planned to, she'd intended to conduct this conversation standing, maintaining the spatial hierarchy of the audience. But something in his voice, the lack of performance in it, made standing feel like a costume she was tired of wearing. The line about watering stones, she said, because she forgot what soil looked like. That's the one most people mention. Most people. I've performed versions of this play in smaller venues, workshop readings mostly, open sessions at frontier cultural posts. The stone line lands every time. People who have stopped doing something they loved, painting, building, writing, reading, they hear that line and something in their face changes. What changes? The mask drops for about half a second. Then it comes back. But in that half second, you can see the version of them that remembers. Thesara felt her jaw tighten. He was describing what had happened to her, in public, in front of her entire court. You're good at this, she said. It was not entirely a compliment. I'm good at noticing. The writing is just the noticing organized. She opened the cabinet behind her desk. Inside was a single book, hand-bound, Thessani leather, the pages edged in faded gold. She hadn't touched it in 23 years. The leather was still smooth. The clasp was tarnished. She set it on the desk between them. This is a collection of Thessani elegies, she said. My mother's favorite. I sealed it the night before my coronation. I haven't opened it since. Hale looked at the book. He didn't reach for it. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they recognize as important without needing to be told, with quiet attention, unhurried, as though the book had all the time it needed to be seen. Why are you showing me this? He asked. Because you wrote a play about a woman who sealed away the thing she loved, and you performed it in front of the woman who actually did it. And now I'm sitting across from you with the sealed thing on the desk, and I need to understand whether this is an extraordinary coincidence or something I should be concerned about. It's an extraordinary coincidence, Hale said. And I'd add that the fact you've unsealed the cabinet, not the book, the cabinet, suggests the play did what I wrote it to do. Which was? Remind you that the seal was a choice, not a condition, not a permanent state, a choice you made at a specific moment for specific reasons, and one you could unmake whenever the reasons changed. Thesara stared at him. 23 years of statecraft had given her an impeccable ability to read deception. She found none. What she found instead was more unsettling. Sincerity. Not the diplomatic kind, raw, structural sincerity. The kind that exists in a person who writes about the sealed thing because they've sealed something too and understand the architecture of it. What did you seal? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, a letter. From my daughter. She wrote it before she died. She was 7, and she was sick, and she dictated it to the ward nurse because her hands couldn't hold a stylus anymore. The nurse transcribed it on actual paper because my daughter insisted. Paper letters are real, she said. Data can be deleted, but paper has to be burned. and nobody burns a letter from a 7-year-old. Thesara's hands went still on the desk. I sealed it in a case and put it in storage when I took the first off-world contract, Hale said. That was 8 years ago. I haven't opened the case. I wrote the play about the Queen and the music because I understand what it means to seal something that's too important to touch and too painful to lose. The Queen in the play isn't you. She's me. You're just the first person in a balcony who noticed. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the embassy complex, morning preparations were underway, the clink of service trays, the hum of translators calibrating. She opened the book. The clasp resisted. 23 years of tarnish had fused the mechanism, and she had to press hard enough that the edge of the metal bit into her thumb. A small pain, a deliberate one. The pages smelled like her mother's study, dried velvetreed ink, and the faint mineral tang of Thessani binding glue. The first elegy was in old Thessani script, the kind her mother had read aloud by lantern light when Thesara was small enough to sit in a lap without protocols intervening. The words blurred, then sharpened. "There's a passage in the fourth elegy," she said. "My mother used to say it was the reason she became a queen, not the power or the duty, the passage. She said if she could spend her reign making the world described in that passage real, the crown would have been worth wearing." "What does the passage say?" Thesara read it. Her voice was steady for the first 2 lines, then unsteady for the third, then steady again for the fourth in the way that voices become when the person speaking has decided to keep going regardless. The passage described a garden, not a metaphor this time, a real garden, the kind her mother had maintained on the palace roof. The final line said, "The work of the hand that waters is never finished, but the garden does not ask for finished. The garden asks for present." When she stopped reading, Hale was still. He simply listened the way the traveler in his play listened, with his entire attention, without performance, without the visible labor of empathy that most people deploy like a diplomatic credential. "That's a better garden metaphor than mine," he said. Thesara laughed, barely a breath, but it was the first genuine laugh she'd produced in the presence of another person since she couldn't remember when. "Your garden metaphor was heavier than it needed to be," she said. "You said so yourself in the play. The Queen tells the traveler the second act sags." "It does sag. I've rewritten it 11 times. The problem is that the garden metaphor has to carry the Queen's dilemma and also work as an actual garden story. And every time I lighten one load, the other collapses." "Show me," Thesara said. She pulled a sheet of writing crystal from the desk drawer. "Show me the second act. I'll tell you where it sags." Hale opened the folio. They worked for 3 hours. The morning session started without the Queen. Dreth sent 2 messages. Thesara sent back a single word, "later," and continued reading. The second act's problem, she told Hale, wasn't the garden metaphor. It was that the Queen in the play stopped speaking in her own voice during the collaboration and started speaking in the traveler's. "She needs to stay herself inside the metaphor," Thesara said. "The garden can be the shared ground, but she tends it differently than he does. She's precise. She counts the rows. She knows the mineral composition of the soil because she's read the agricultural reports. He works by instinct and she works by data, and the garden needs both. But the play loses that distinction in the second act because you wrote them merging. They shouldn't merge. They should complement." Hale stared at her. Then he picked up the stylus and started rewriting. She picked up a second stylus. "May I?" He pushed the folio to the center of the desk. She wrote in the margin, a Queen's handwriting, precise and architectural. She wrote a line for the Queen character. "You water by feel. I water by schedule. The garden doesn't care which method we use, as long as neither of us stops." Hale read it. "Read it again." Set the stylus down and pressed both hands flat on the desk in the gesture of a person absorbing a blow that isn't painful but is significant. "That's the line," he said. "That's the line the second act has been missing." I know, Thessara said. I've been waiting 23 years to write it. They revised the third act next. She found a passage where the Queen's monologue about the dying garden ran too long, the Queen listing every plant species she'd failed to save. Cut this, Thessara said, drawing a line through 8 sentences. She doesn't need to name everything she lost. She only needs to name the one thing she'd save if she could save one. Which is? The point was the original planting, a single stubborn rootstock that the garden's first tender had put in decades before the Queen inherited any of it. The first thing planted, Thessara said. The thing that was there before she arrived, that will outlive her if she lets it. The Queen isn't mourning the garden she failed. She's mourning the fact that she stopped noticing the part of the garden that was alive without her help. Hale wrote it down. Then he looked up and said quietly, "You're not editing my play, you're writing yours." "I'm doing both. Is that a problem?" "It's the opposite of a problem." By midday they'd finished. They read the revised play aloud together, Thessara taking the Queen's lines, Hale taking the Travelers'. The anteroom had no audience. The windows showed the compound gardens below, still overgrown, still neglected. But Thessara read the Queen's lines in her own voice, not the clipped performance voice, not the Velkian diplomatic register, but the voice she'd used as a girl reciting elegies to her mother. And when she reached the revised passage about the dying garden, her voice held. Not because it was easy, because the line they'd written together, the watering line, gave the Queen permission to be precise and vulnerable at the same time, to count the rows and also to grieve them. Hale gathered the revised pages. "I'm performing the full play again tonight. Last evening of the exchange, the revised version. In front of the full delegation. In front of everyone who was in that hall last night, plus whoever shows up for the finale. The line about watering stones, we changed it. The Queen says she's been watering stones, but now she adds, and some of them sprouted anyway because I didn't know the difference and neither did the water." "Yes. You're going to perform that in front of my entire court. They'll know. Dreth will know. He's already writing his assessment of my reaction to last night's performance. When he hears new lines in tonight's version, lines that weren't in the original, he'll calculate the gap and realize I spent those hours with you. He'll frame that conclusion in the most politically unfavorable terms available. I know. And you're going to perform it anyway. The question isn't whether I perform it. The question is whether you sit in the balcony and listen to words we wrote together and pretend you don't recognize them. Or whether you listen and let your face do what it did last night, that half second when the mask dropped and the person behind it remembered. You saw that. I was looking for it. I look for it every time. Most people in balconies never give me that half second. You gave me 4. 4 seconds is a diplomatic incident in some cultures. In mine, it's an honest review." He left with the folio under his arm. Thessara stood in the anteroom with the book of elegies open on the desk, and the morning light coming through the windows, and she thought about what it meant to water something you'd neglected and discover it was still alive. She walked to the window and looked down at the embassy gardens. 3 stories below, the hedges had been shaped once. She could see the ghosts of their geometry in the wild growth. The fountain basin was green with mineral scale, the water channels cracked. Nobody had tended this garden in years. She recognized the metaphor. She'd been living inside it. Dreth appeared in the doorway within the hour. "Your luminance missed the morning session entirely." "I'm aware. Delegate Korsh from the Sorelian hegemony noted your absence." He interpreted it as a signal regarding the trade compact. Additionally, the Merkai Defense Attaché submitted a formal inquiry regarding the periphery escalation timeline. "Tell Korsh the Queen had a prior commitment. The trade compact will receive my seal as scheduled. And tell the Merkai Attaché I will address the periphery timeline at the afternoon briefing." And the nature of the prior commitment? Counselor Verath has been asking. He's spoken with your sister's office. Aelith's faction, circling. The vote of diminished confidence her sister had been building toward for 3 years required evidence of compromised judgment. Missing a morning session to spend 3 hours with a human playwright was exactly the kind of material Aelith's allies would use. Tell Counselor Verath that the nature of my commitments is not subject to his inquiry, Thessara said. And tell my sister that if she intends to question my judgment, she should do it to my face at council. Dreth hesitated. Your Luminance, I am not questioning your judgment. I am noting that appearances. Appearances are performances, Counselor. I've given enough performances. The afternoon brought 3 complications, each demanding the version of her that didn't feel anything. The Sorelian hegemony wanted a revised tariff annex. Their proposed revision would cost the Velkian treasury 4% of its annual freight revenue. Thessara read their proposal, identified the 3 clauses they'd buried in the appendix that would give them unilateral renegotiation rights in 2 years, struck those clauses, and sent it back with a counter-proposal that locked the terms for a decade. The Sorelians accepted within the hour. The periphery briefing confirmed a 3rd frontier station had gone dark. Thessara listened to the intelligence summary, asked 4 questions the briefing officer couldn't answer, and ordered a second assessment from the field commanders rather than the diplomatic analysts. The field assessment was worse than the diplomatic version but more useful. Between sessions, Counselor Solène, Aelith's most patient operative, intercepted her in the corridor. Your Luminance, your sister sends her regards and hopes the cultural exchange has been enriching. It has. She also noted that the human delegation's performance was unconventional. Several members of the advisory council found it presumptuous. A play about a queen who sealed away art, performed in front of a queen. Some felt it was calculated. Some felt it was honest, Thessara said, which is more alarming to them than calculation would be. Solène's smile didn't waver. Your sister merely wishes to ensure that the Queen's engagement with the human delegation remains within diplomatic parameters. Counselor Solène, I have sealed a trade compact that saves this dynasty 4% of its freight revenue. I have drafted a contingency authorization for a war that your faction has been content to ignore for 6 months. I have done both of these things in the afternoon of a day that began with a creative collaboration that your faction considers a security breach. If my sister would like to compare the productivity of my morning with the productivity of her entire week, I welcome the comparison. Solène inclined her head and withdrew. Thessara changed into a formal gown and took her seat in the royal balcony at 1830. The evening performance drew a larger audience. Word had spread, the Humans' play had been discussed over breakfast, analyzed during policy sessions, quoted in corridor conversations. The Korethi ambassador had requested a text copy. The Velkathi cultural attaché had called it the most dangerous thing I've seen performed at a diplomatic function, which from a Velkathi was high praise. Dreth sat behind her, rigid with vigilance. 2 additional council members had positioned themselves in adjacent seats, Verath and Solène, Aelith's allies, there to observe and report. The balcony felt like a surveillance apparatus disguised as a theater box. She didn't care. The other performances ran first. Thessara watched them, but something had shifted behind the composure. She listened differently. When the Merkai choir performed a harmonic piece about stellar navigation, she heard the loneliness underneath the technical precision. When the Tesserin delegation performed a comedic sketch about trade negotiations, she heard the anxiety beneath the humor. A young species trying to be taken seriously by laughing at themselves before anyone else could. When the Korethi performed a ritual chant about ancestral memory, she heard grief codified as ceremony. She was hearing. For the first time in years she was hearing. Then the lights changed, and Hale walked out with his chair and his table and his folio, and Thessara's hands closed on the armrests. He began the same way. This is a play about a queen who stopped listening to music. But the rhythms were different now, tighter, the transitions faster, the characters more distinct. The queen's voice had changed. Underneath the precision there was a current of something that hadn't been there before. A kind of restrained yearning, not for the traveler, but for the thing the traveler had reminded her she could do. The first movement ended with the queen's monologue at the window. Hale delivered it exactly as before, quiet, private. But Thessara heard it differently now. The line about counting the measures, she'd heard it last night as her own secret shame. Tonight she heard it as a universal one. Every person in that hall who had ever sat through a performance and counted the minutes to its end. The second act didn't sag. When the queen and the traveler began their collaboration, the two voices stayed separate. His intuitive and searching, her structured and precise. The play within the play emerging from the space between them like a plant growing in the gap between two stones. The revised monologue about the dying garden was sharper. The queen didn't catalog every lost species. She named one, the original root stock. I spent so long mourning what I'd failed to grow, the queen said, that I stopped seeing the thing that was growing without my help. It didn't need my schedule or my data. It needed me to notice it was still there. Verath shifted in his seat. Thessara felt his gaze. Let him look, let him report. And then their line. You water by feel, the queen said. I water by schedule. The garden doesn't care which method we use, as long as neither of us stops. Thessara heard her own words in a human voice on a diplomatic stage in front of 200 delegates, and the place behind her ribs, the place she'd thought had sealed over 23 years ago, opened. Not dramatically. It opened the way a flower opens, slowly, inevitably, because the conditions had changed, and the thing that had been waiting was no longer willing to wait. The revised stone line landed. I've been watering stones because I forgot what soil looked like, and some of them sprouted anyway, because I didn't know the difference and neither did the water. The Korethi ambassador made a sound, a hum of recognition, the kind a person makes when a sentence reorganizes something they'd been carrying. Dreth leaned forward. Your Luminance, the revised text. Be quiet, counselor. The play ended the same way. The queen placed the manuscript in the public archive. She reopened the cultural program. She found the traveler on the morning of his departure. But Hale performed the ending looking directly at the royal balcony. Not at Thessara specifically, at the whole box, the architecture of observation and judgment. And in his eyes was not romance, not seduction, not the performance of tenderness that actors deploy. In his eyes was the steady, unremarkable gaze of a person who'd said something true and was waiting to see whether it would be received. The applause was longer this time. Several delegates stood. The Korethi ambassador was on his feet immediately. The Velkathi cultural attaché removed her observation visor, the Velkathi equivalent of a standing ovation. Even the Tesserin junior diplomats stood, their datapads lowered. Thessara stood last. She stood slowly and she did not applaud. She placed her right hand over the place behind her ribs, a Thessani gesture that most of the room would not recognize, but that Dreth and Hale and anyone who'd studied Thessani mourning customs would understand. It meant I hear you. Not I love you, not I choose you, something smaller and harder and more honest. I hear you. Your words reached the place I thought was sealed. It isn't sealed. Thank you for knowing the difference between opening a door and breaking one down. Behind her, Verath whispered to Solène, the gesture, she used the listening right, in public. Thessara heard him. She didn't turn. What Verath understood about the gesture was the protocol. What he could not catalog in a report to Aelith's faction was the feeling. The gesture was a container, just like the Korethi chant loss made bearable by form. But tonight, For the first time since she'd learned it as a girl, the form held actual content. She wasn't performing the gesture. She was using it. After the performance, she did not arrange a private meeting. She did not send Dreth to summon the human writer to a secure anteroom. She did not create the conditions for a quiet, deniable conversation. She walked to the reception hall where the performers mingled with delegates. The hall was crowded, delegates clustered in species groups, service staff circulating with trays of filtered water and Thessani grain cakes. Hale was near the back, the folio tucked under his arm, speaking with a junior Tesserin diplomat who was quoting lines from the play back at him. Thessara crossed the entire length of the reception hall. Every step was visible. Every delegate tracked her path, a queen moving with purpose and direction toward a human playwright with no credentials, no rank, and a leather-bound folio. She stopped in front of Hale and she said, in front of Dreth and Verath and Solen and the Korethi ambassador, and every recorder and analyst in the room, the revised second act holds. The garden metaphor works because the queen stays herself inside it. I know because I helped her. The room recalibrated. Dreth's face went through 4 expressions in 2 seconds. Verath and Solen exchanged glances. The Korethi ambassador looked from Thessara to Hale and back, with the expression of a career diplomat who has just realized something is happening that isn't in the briefing documents. Hale met her eyes. The line about watering by schedule, that was yours. It was mine, and I am not embarrassed by it, and I am not going to pretend I didn't write it, and I am not going to let my counsel frame a creative collaboration as a security breach. She turned to Dreth. You may include this conversation in your advisory report, counselor, word for word. I want the record to reflect that the queen of the Velkayan dynasty collaborated on a work of art with a human delegate, that the collaboration produced a more honest piece than either of us could have written alone, and that I consider this the most productive diplomatic outcome of the entire exchange. She turned to Verath. Counselor Verath, I know you're here on my sister's behalf. Tell Aelith this. The queen spent 3 hours this morning revising a second act with a human playwright, and in those 3 hours she remembered something the crown made her forget. If Aelith considers that grounds for diminished confidence, she is welcome to bring the motion. But she should know that the queen who walks into that chamber will not be the queen who has been sleepwalking through the last 23 years of governance. She'll be the one who woke up. Aelith may find that version harder to diminish. Verath said nothing, but something in his expression shifted, a recalculation. The woman speaking to him was not the distracted queen he'd been assigned to observe. She was sharper, more present, more dangerous in the way that clarity is always dangerous to people who depend on fog. Thessara looked at Hale. He was holding the folio against his chest, both hands pressed flat against the leather, the way a person holds something they've just realized is no longer only theirs. Stay for the week, she said. We have a third act to discuss. The third act is finished. The play's third act. I'm talking about the garden. The real one. 3 stories below my study window. It's badly maintained and the fountain is clogged with mineral deposits. I've been looking at it for 3 days and seeing an infrastructure deficiency. This morning I looked at it and saw a garden that someone stopped tending, and I'd like to know what it looks like when someone starts again. Hale studied her face. Whatever he found there, not a mask, not the 4-second drop, but the face of a woman who decided the seal was a choice and she was unmaking it, made him close the folio and set it on the nearest table. I'll need soil samples, he said. I'll have the groundskeeper provide them. And the queen's schedule for the week. My schedule is my own. Ask me what I've lost today and I'll tell you. Ask me again tomorrow. The title is negotiable. The week extended into a month. The month became a residency, the first human artist in residence in the history of the Velkayan court, a position that had no precedent and therefore no protocol, which meant Dreth had to invent one from scratch. a task that occupied him so thoroughly he produced fewer surveillance memos, which Thessara considered an additional benefit. They wrote together. Not every day Thessara had a dynasty to run, a war in the periphery to manage, a sister's faction to outmaneuver. But in the margins of governance, in the hours between policy sessions, in the early mornings when the embassy gardens caught the first light and the fountain now unclogged, the mineral deposits cleared, the water running clean through repaired channels, made the sound her mother's garden had made, they wrote. The garden became their other collaboration. Hale studied the compound's ground composition with the same methodical attention he brought to dramatic structure. Thessara provided the data, water table analysis, seasonal temperature curves, mineral content reports. He provided the instinct, which plants would thrive in alkaline soil, which needed shade, which could anchor the eroding hillside. Eilith never brought the motion. The political calculus had shifted. The queen who emerged from the cultural exchange was sharper, more decisive, more publicly visible than the queen who'd entered it. The trade compact held. The periphery war stabilized after the field assessment led to a targeted intervention the diplomatic analysts had been too cautious to recommend. The Korethi ambassador formally requested that the conquered establish a permanent cultural residency program modeled on the Velkayan arrangement. The motion passed unanimously, the first unanimous cultural motion in conquered history. Dreth told her with the tone of a man conceding a point he'd argued against for months. Not his influence, Thessara said. His question, he asked me what I'd lost. Everyone else was asking what I should gain. Hale asked her every morning. Not always the same question. Some mornings it was, what did you lose today? And some it was, what did you hear? And some it was simply, what are you reading? But every morning in the anteroom with the open book and the real windows and the sound of the tended garden below, he asked, and she answered, and neither of them counted the measures until it was finished. Thessara never sealed the book again. It sat on her desk, open to a different page each morning, the faded gold edges catching light that came through real windows onto real pages onto the desk of a queen who had remembered what it meant to hear something and feel it land somewhere behind her ribs, in the place that had never sealed over, that had only been waiting, patient and quiet and unextinguished, for something worth opening for. The garden grew, not fast, not perfectly, but present, always present.